Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Geological Society of London, and this the 5th Shell lecture for 2013, with a question mark in its title, Carbon Capture and Storage, Capturing Global Opportunities and Injecting Fresh Energy into the Oil and Gas Industry. My name is David Shilston. I'm President of the Society, and it's my pleasure to thank Shell UK for making this series of public lectures possible. In January 2013, the Global CCS Institute reduced its list of large-scale integrated carbon capture and storage projects down by 3 to 72. In March this year, the UK government announced 2 preferred bidders for its CCS demonstration competition, 6 years after the first competition was launched. And most recently in April, the EU relaunched the NER 300 programme to look again at renewable energy and CCS funding candidates. This relaunch follows last year's upset when none of the original bidders secured government-matched funding. Clearly, there are still hurdles to overcome if the vision of carbon dioxide emissions and storing them safely underground is to become reality. So we have a number of questions. Why has it taken so much longer than expected? What role can CCS play in achieving global ambitions for reducing carbon emissions? What can CCS offer to host governments, project developers and national industries? And where does the greatest potential for a global CCS industry hub lie? Paul Garnham is CCS project manager for Shell, and he's here this evening to help us find answers to these questions. Paul graduated in chemical engineering from Imperial College in 1977, and he's clocked up 32 years with Shell, and during that time has worked in a wide variety of posts. But relevant to us today, since the late 2008, he's been front-end development manager for the GOLDENEYE CCS project, where he leads an integrated facilities, wells and subsurface technical team based primarily in Aberdeen, but also drawing on Shell's global expertise. The initial project, founded on LONGANNET power station in Scotland near Edinburgh, was effectively the winner of UK Demo 1 for CCS competition, but was cancelled, as we've said, for commercial reasons in October 2011. From that project emerged the proposal based on Peterhead power station, also in Scotland, which would also use the offshore GOLDENEYE depleted gas reservoir. We have much to learn this evening, and it's a great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paul Garnham.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone for coming in this evening. Let me say, when I was preparing this presentation last week, I went back to the abstract, and my first reaction was, oh my goodness, did I really promise to do all of that in 45 minutes? And then I thought, well, I'm doing one at 3 o'clock, one at 6 o'clock, so I'll just do the first half at 3. No, you'll get the full Monty, don't worry. That's the Shell disclaimer, which I'm obliged to show you. You're not obliged to read it, though. So basically what it says is, if you listen to what I say and rush out and buy Shell shares as a result, then be it on your own head. So I'm down from Aberdeen to the Geological Society, and I had to start with a picture of some Scottish rock. So this is SGURR CHOINNICH Moor. It's one of the 282 Scottish Munros, which I'm climbing with my son. That's Ben in the picture there, so I'm climbing the Bens with Ben. And from a geological point of view, this is quartzite, and this is in an area known as the Grey Corries because of the quartz. But the real reason for showing this is to make the point that Ben walks with his hands in his pockets because it's cold in the Scottish hills. And I'm always telling him, Ben, please take your hands out of your pockets, because if you fall, you need to break your fall. 2 minutes later, he puts them back in his pockets. So last trip out, I tried a new tack. I said, Ben, I know you're thinking I'm talking a lot of old tosh, but in 20 years' time, you'll be telling your own kids to do exactly the same thing. And that struck a chord. And it made me realize that actually, if I personalize the message, it will strike a chord. So I'm going to be a little bit more personal today. And metaphorically, this is a call for us all to take hands out of the pockets in case we fall. So the talk is broken into 6 parts. We'll start with why CCS. So I'll go back to basics because I realise not everyone is a CCS expert. And then there's a little bit of a personal journey, a bit on why gas as opposed to coal, and then some details on the Peterhead project, which I'm working on at the moment. And then we'll broaden out into the global picture. And as David has already hinted, you know, why are we not doing as well as we thought, as well as we should? So a lot of ground to cover. So apologies if I move quite quickly, but there will be time for questions and answers at the end. So let's go back to basics. Why CCS? Why do we need to do carbon capture and storage? And it starts with use of energy and energy extravagance. So let me explain. This is not my driveway in Aberdeen. This is actually North America. But the point is, it's a heated driveway. So as a planet, we are actually quite extravagant. And I think we're all to blame. I was in the study putting the slides together on Saturday, and my good lady Susan came in. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm putting a presentation together on energy usage and the need to cut down." She said, "So why have you got 3 lights on?" So we're all to blame. Me too. So energy extravagance, part of it, but also a big element is sort of increasing global populations. Have a good look at this slide, because it's a very simple slide, but it tells quite an alarming story. You know, between the year 2000 and 2050, the world population will increase by 50%. That's that's 6 billion up to, let's say, 9 billion. That's a huge increase, and of course, the more people, the more energy we use. But there's a double whammy. Not only are there more people, but those people per head are using more energy. So the bottom line there, per head, you know, we've increased our energy usage. And part of the story here is that as countries go up the development curve, they go up the energy ladder, they use more and more energy per head. And the worrying thing, if you look at the little reference in the bottom left to China and India, they're still bottom left, and those are the 2 most populous countries in the world. So they have a long way to go, but I don't think it will take them very long to get up the curve and start using more and more energy. So that's painting a picture of increasing energy demand. We've seen it for the last few years, and it's going to continue. So let's make that quite clear. And to meet that energy demand, there is no silver bullet. It's not a case of just renewables or just nuclear. A large slice of the pie is going to have to continue to come from fossil fuels. So you can surf the web and you can find different projections, but let's not argue about the precise numbers. I think the message is clear. We will continue to use a very large slice of fossil fuels, and you know, the fossil fuel part in the energy mix will continue beyond 2030, 2050. So that's established energy usage and increasing demand. And now I just want to briefly try to make the link with CO2 emissions and hence global warming. And not everyone gets this, so bear with me if you do understand the story. So the more fossil fuels we burn, the more CO2 we emit. And I think that's generally accepted. But if you're looking for some evidence, again, there's a lot on the web. And that picture on the left is one that you've probably seen before. This is taken from cores through the ice in the Antarctic that shows that CO2 levels have increased dramatically since the Industrial Revolution, since we started burning fossil fuels. And then the link with temperature, there's lots of correlations out there, but the picture on the right shows that in the same sort of time span, global temperatures have increased quite a lot. And there's you can argue about the numbers, but I hope that message, that link between burning fossil fuels, emitting carbon dioxide, global temperature increase, I hope that is understood. But what does all of that mean? So let me refer to the Stockholm Environment Institute. So their consideration is that a temperature increase of only 2 degrees takes us from what is tolerable to what is dangerous. And we could, again, spend all day debating the numbers and debating the definitions, but I hope that underlying message is clear. And if we accept 2 degrees centigrade as kind of the point at which we need to really react, then we need to start doing that now, because to to limit temperatures to 2 degrees C, we need to remove 75% of the carbon emissions, and that over a 40-year period is a reduction of 2% per annum. So that's my message, but it's not a new message. I don't know whether anyone recognises the very distinguished Scottish gentleman in the picture, but it's Alexander Graham Bell. And when he wasn't busy making phone calls, he was actually the first person to, I think, coin the phrase greenhouse gas. So that was 1917, nearly a century ago. So the whole phenomenon of global warming and greenhouse gases has long since been recognised. And as long ago as 1997, the planet started trying to do something about it with the Kyoto Protocol. So there's a lot of text on there, because when you start talking about global warming and greenhouse gases, it gets complicated. You have to define what baseline you're referring to and exactly which greenhouse gases you're including in the mix. So apologies for all the text. But the message is clear that those countries that signed up to the Kyoto Protocol believe they've cracked the problem. It actually ran out at the end of 2012, end of last year. But in that period, global emissions continued to climb. So here's what I'm trying to say, that despite the fact the world recognises the problem and is trying to do something about it, CO2 levels continue to rise relentlessly. So no surprise that only 3 weeks ago, and this is the BBC website from the 10th of May, only 3 weeks ago, global CO2 levels in the atmosphere reached 400 parts per million. Now, there's nothing magic about 400 parts per million, except it's kind of symbolic. And there's a whole debate raging around, well, what's really the crucial level when alarm bells start to ring? And some people say it's 500, and some people say, well, it's 400, and some people say, well, actually, alarm bells should have been ringing at 300. But it's another symptom of this relentless increase. And for me, if there's one slide I show tonight that you remember, if you fall asleep for the remaining 40 minutes, then please just remember this one. So this is from the MAUNA Lower Observatory in Hawaii, and that's, I think, generally accepted as sort of the benchmark of CO2 atmospheric measurements. And this shows, as I say, a relentless climb, 2009 to 2014. So we've got there a 10 ppm increase in 5 years. So a steady climb of 2 ppm per year. Just to explain, I'm looking at the dark line, which is sort of the annual averaged number. The red line is a monthly plot, and the reason it goes up and down, it's the seasonal variation in vegetation in the northern hemisphere. So concentrate on the dark line. You'll see, as I say, a relentless increase, and hence the need to do something about the problem. Just very quickly, in the UK, the story is somewhat better. We actually have seen a decline. So there's two lines there. The upper one is the whole basket of greenhouse gases, generally acknowledged to be 6 gases, and you take the sort of weighted contribution. If we just want to talk about CO2, carbon dioxide, then it's the lower line, and you'll see that that's in terms of millions of tons. The provisional 2012 figure is about 480 millions of tons that we as a nation emitted last year. So a story of gradual decline in the UK, but, there's a big but the 2012 figure does actually show an increase over 2011. And the twist here is that we're starting to actually revert to coal. And I'll come back to the coal versus gas argument. But last year we reverted to coal because it's being displaced from the States by the cheaper shale gas in the States. So shipments of coal are coming over and being increasingly used in UK power stations. So no room for complacency. Just taking that figure of 480 million tons and taking the UK population as roughly 60 million, just again trying to personalise it for you and for me, that's about 8 tons for each of us. last year that we emitted. Now this, I stress, is industrial use, domestic use, transport. It's the whole basket of CO2 emissions, but that's 8 tons each. And if you want to visualize that, I drive a BMW X3. It's not nearly as shiny as the one in the picture, but just to say it weighs, if anyone has ever weighed a BMW, it's just under 2 tons. So each of us emitted 4 and a bit X3s in weight last year. So that, as I say, is the scale of the problem. So that's the case for doing something about it. And well, why CCS? So CCS is not the only solution. I don't want to give the impression that CCS is the be-all and the end-all. It's one of a number of tools in the toolbox that we can use to reduce carbon. I'll tell you more in a minute about how CCS reduces carbon. But let me start with a couple of figures, which you've probably seen. Certainly they're quoted often in the CCS industry, that without CCS, the costs to halve emissions will be 40% higher by 2050. And CCS itself has the potential to reduce CO2 emissions by 17%. And those are figures from the IEA, the International Energy Agency. And I'll come back to that data later on. So the message is CCS is part of the solution. It's not the only solution, it's part of the solution. And this is a graph that I've seen actually used by UK government officials. So there's lots of projections about how the energy mix will look in the UK over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Again, we could argue about the numbers, but the point is it will be a combination of nuclear and renewables and fossil fuels. No one of those on its own will cater for this increasing demand. So fossil fuels have to be in the mix. You know, globally, they're contributing about 80%. That's not going to change. But CCS can help reduce the CO2 that is emitted by those fossil fuels. So just to be clear, that dark blue slice is fossil fuels in conjunction with CCS, actually showing an increasing slice until 2050. And the demand line is this dark line. So that's the predicted energy demand in the UK. So that's the case for CCS. Just to recap, you know, more and more energy being used. Fossil fuels has got to be part of that mix. That will inevitably involve CO2 being emitted. We don't want too much to get into the atmosphere because the temperature will then get to the point where it's alarming. And so CCS is part of the solution. So again, trying to personalize this, let me just spend 10 minutes taking you on my own kind of personal low carbon journey. And for me, it started with this video. It's a DVD, it's still available. It's called An Inconvenient Truth, and it was produced in 2006. I don't know whether anyone, I'm sure several of you have seen it. Actually won 2 Oscars, 2 Academy Awards in 2006. And essentially it's a documentary, it's a record of Al Gore's journey around the States, talking about global warming and talking about, you know, CCS as part of the solution. Al Gore, if the name doesn't ring a bell, was a vice president of the States, didn't quite make it to president, famously was beaten by George Bush in the very controversial election of 2000. But when he lost that election campaign, this is what he reverted to, was advocating that we do something as a planet about global warming. And it's full of good images of receding glaciers, you know, the glacier 50 years ago and the glacier now. So I can thoroughly recommend the video if you haven't seen it. So inspired by that, really, I was seconded by Shell to start up the Energy Technologies Institute. I don't know whether there's anyone from the ETI in the audience tonight. So I was the first person through the door. I was the chief operating officer for a year. I helped run the process that chose Loughborough as the location. I actually can't say that in Aberdeen because Aberdeen was one of the contenders and they'd shoot me if I'd known I'd taken it to Loughborough. And I came back from that secondment to Shell, and I heard a whisper that we had a field, the name of which is GOLDENEYE, Nothing to do with James Bond, everything to do with ducks. So all our fields are named after seabirds. But we had a field which was about to run out in terms of producing hydrocarbons, and the feeling was it could make an ideal store for basically CO2, carbon dioxide. And to cut a quite long story short, we ended up in a consortium with Scottish Power and National Grid. We actually displaced Marathon from the consortium and kind of gate crashed the party a bit. We ended up in a consortium that was proposing a scheme based on Longannet, and Longannet, as David said, is a coal-fired power station just west of Edinburgh. And Longannet entered into a competition which actually Gordon Brown started when he was still Chancellor in 2007. And that's the so-called Demo 1 competition. And for me and the team, a real red-letter day was 20th of October 2010, because on that day, two things happened. The Chancellor, who by then was George Osborne, announced that the prize for this competition was £1 billion. That's not a million, that's £1 billion. And on the same day, the other competing bid, which was from E.ON and based on a power station proposed to be built at Kings North on the Thames Estuary, North Kent, E.ON pulled out, leaving us effectively as the winners of the £1 billion prize money. We would have won it anyway, but just excellent. And honestly, on that day, I thought George Osborne was going to give me £1 billion to go and spend and build my carbon capture plant. Unfortunately, didn't quite work out like that. The project, as David suggested at the beginning, was cancelled for commercial reasons. I stress not for technical reasons. I think our technical solution was fairly universally admired, and not being arrogant. I think a lot of people bought into the technical solution, but it failed. The project failed for commercial reasons. But as I keep telling the team, we were fortunate to have a plan B, and even more fortunate that plan B was better than plan A, because out of the ashes of the Longannet scheme came a new scheme based on Peterhead. And for Shell, the real contrast was Longannet was a coal power station and Peterhead is a gas power station. And at the end of the day, Shell is not a coal company. We don't sell coal, but we do sell oil and gas. And so there's a lot more interest in Shell around Peterhead and a lot more support from the very, very highest level. Incidentally, these are my photos. The one of Longannet was one I took and is now blown up as large as a screen in the Longannet Visitor Centre. And this is one I took at Peterhead on a very cold December evening, and the lovely blue skies, because it was just about to start snowing. And just the logo there is SSE, so Longannet was operated by Scottish Power, Peterhead operated by a different power company, SSE. So the previous competition, Demo 1, was cancelled by the government, and we're talking about DEC, incidentally. It's the Department of Energy and Climate Change. I'll refer to them a couple of times. So they obviously the previous competition died, got resurrected as a new competition, and this is our entry in the new competition last July, as long ago as last July, 25 minutes before the deadline. We delivered 11 box loads as our competition submission. And things have moved on since then, and you're probably mostly aware, David mentioned it in the intro, that the Chancellor on Budget Day this year announced that Peterhead, alongside the White Rose project in Yorkshire, have been selected to go forward. So the slide shows the 4 semi-finalists. So we're in the final, and I understand it's going to be played at Wembley next month. Okay. No, seriously, I think, although I'm bound by competition rules from saying too much, I think most observers would conclude that both projects, both ourselves and White Rose, have a good chance of going forward, and the £1 billion, which is still there as prize money, is quite like to be shared between the two. And actually, Peterhead and White Rose is a good mix: 1 Scottish, 1 English, 1 coal, 1 gas, and as you'll hear, 1 depleted hydrocarbon reservoir and 1 saline aquifer reservoir. So it's from the government's perspective, it's quite a good solution. Just very quickly, 5 slides on why gas. I mean, Shell gas company, you're probably thinking, well, he would say all of this, but why do we think gas is a better solution, particularly with CO2 emissions in mind, better solution than coal? One is, and these are 5 A's, okay, so a little bit contrived, bear with me. Gas is abundant, lots of it. If we carry on at the same rate of production, it will last for another 250 years. So I'll just whisk through these. Gas is accessible, again, a busy slide, but just to make the point, there's a lot of gas infrastructure in place, obviously in Europe and beyond, so readily accessible. Gas is acceptable, so from an environmental point of view, it's acceptable. It emits less CO2 than coal when you burn it, and I'll come back to that point in a minute, and particularly when you compare it with some of the older coal power stations that we have in the UK. Gas is affordable insofar as gas power plants are cheaper to build, they have lower capital costs, more energy efficient. I have to say, go back to my earlier comment, that right at the moment, gas in the States is cheap, and so coal is becoming cheaper as a result. And lastly, gas is available, and let me just take time out to explain this one. It's a phenomenon which I hope you'll recognise, particularly in Scotland, but I think also in England. We have a lot of wind farms, so when I go climbing the Munros, I always see a wind farm. But the trouble with wind is it doesn't blow when you need it. So we have a lot of those really cold days when the wind stops blowing, and you need to be able to turn on something like gas. So gas is instantly available, and I'm talking now about power stations rather than the cooker in your home, but the power stations can turn on very, very quickly when wind power is not available. So just to explain the slide, the temperature is shown in the blue bars, and you see the days on which it drops very low, and this is rather arbitrarily showing 2010, 2011, but the days on which the temperature is really low, the wind output, which is the red line, also drops. So, as I say, a lot of those clear, still, cold days. Okay, let's tell you a bit more now about the Peterhead project. So Peterhead, just north of Aberdeen, less than an hour's drive, known as the Blue Toon, because many years ago they used to wear blue trousers. This is the fisher folk in particular, used to wear blue leggings. Someone tried to kid me on that this is where jeans were invented, but don't quite believe that one. Anyway, so Peterhead power station, we are going to capture the CO2 from the flue gas. I'll show you a bit more detail in a minute, and pipe it offshore to the Goldeneye field. So just to be clear, the Longannet project had Goldeneye as its store or its sink, and the Peterhead project is using that suggestion again. And that red dotted line is a pipeline which already exists. So that pipeline has been bringing hydrocarbon gas onshore from the Goldeneye field for the last 10 years. So that pipeline is currently sitting on the seabed. The field has stopped producing a couple of years ago, so it's really ready for CO2 injection. It's about 102 kilometers long, that pipeline. You'll see a couple of options from Peterhead. We can either use onshore pipelines up to St Fergus, which is a big gas terminal, which is where the offshore pipeline comes into, or we can go straight offshore with a new pipeline, and we're tending towards the latter one, but that debate is still going on. Just to make the case for the northeast of Scotland, this is an initiative that the Energy Technologies Institute I mentioned earlier on conducted a couple of years ago to map all the possible stores for CO2, both hydrocarbon reservoirs and saline aquifers, because the industry believes that the future ultimately will be in these big aquifers. And you can see there a map where the circles, the size of the circle depicts the size of the store, and you can see what a great terminal Peterhead or St Fergus would be, because this is all the sort of potential stores in the North Sea, and there's a sort of by a nice coincidence they all sort of focus in on Peterhead. So the point I would make is, you know, if you're going to start somewhere, Peterhead, St Fergus is a great location to start. And just to get the timing straight, so, you know, we've been selected to go forward. Still a lot of water to flow under the bridge before we get there. We've got to go through what we call FEED, front-end engineering and design, which will take, let's say, 12 to 18 months before we actually start building the kit at Peterhead and offshore. So if we build, construct in 2015, 16, we would start injecting CO2 into the old reservoir 2017, 18, let's say. So just to set expectations, this is not going to happen tomorrow. There's still a lot of work to do. Just take you very quickly through the scheme. I kind of follow the molecule, the CO2 molecule that is. So it originates at Peterhead Power Station. If we didn't do anything about it, it would go up that chimney on the right and contribute to global warming. So what we're proposing to do is capture it at source at Peterhead. So if you just hold that picture in your mind, because as I move to the next one, this is a computerized image from the same angle. And the reason for showing this one, it shows you the new kit that we propose to build. So all the blue buildings there are associated with the carbon capture. And that tall blue tower is actually where we absorb the carbon dioxide into an amine. So that's a chemical. The chemistry is actually quite an old chemistry, but we absorb it into the amine. That captures it from the flue gas. And then we have to use heat to get the CO2 out of the amine and end up with very, very pure CO2, which we then pipe offshore. But that, I have to stress, is quite it's an old chemistry. The challenges are in scaling up to this size and the fact that it uses a lot of heat. At the moment, it's firmly quite an inefficient process. Just sticking with the slide, the other thing to note is this sort of mustardy yellow ducting is huge. These are ducts that are 6 meters by 6 meters square. So, you know, you're dealing with large volumes of gas at low pressures. So quite you know, big volumes. Just to kind of tell you a little bit about the difference between coal and gas. So coal is dirtier. If you burn coal, there's 12% CO2 in the flue gas. And this is the absorber that you need. This is the one that we're building in Canada. So that's about 11 meter by 11 meters square. If you move from coal to gas, it actually gets more difficult to capture the CO2. There's less of it. So it's about 4% versus 12%. There's less of it in the flue gas. You have to work harder to capture it. So you need a bigger absorber and something about 3 times as big in terms of cross-sectional area. So let's say 20 by 20 meters. So it's more difficult to capture, but the good news is there's less of it for the same unit of electricity. So you have less to then transport and store. So it's kind of pros and cons. But it does mean that the absorber we build at Peterhead is quite a large tower. It's you know, large cross-sectional area. It's about 50 meters tall. But you saw in the earlier image, the visual obtrusiveness is not great. It's alongside the power station. In fact, it's dwarfed by the power station. So the pipeline, as I said, it's there already, and a large part of the sort of value proposition of our project is that we are reusing existing infrastructure. So that pipeline exists today, and same with the offshore kit. The platform exists. We're going to reuse most of that steel, and we're going to reuse the wells. So just for those of you who are in the oil business and understand what I'm talking about when I refer to wells, the platform has 5 wells which have been producing mainly gas for the last 10 years. If we did nothing about it, the CO2, which is by this stage a liquid under pressure, so 100 bars, if we did nothing, that liquid would expand as soon as it got to the wells. It would flash, and for the chemical engineers amongst you, you'd get a Joule-Thomson cooling, which would rapidly take the temperature down to about minus 30 degrees. And that brings all manner of problems, contraction of the steel, freezing of the fluids. So to preempt that, what we have to do is take those wells, take the tubing in the wells and replace it with a smaller bore tubing. So we're basically kind of choking back the flow, avoiding that sudden pressure drop and that sudden flash. So that's probably the biggest technical challenge that we've got offshore. The reservoir, and because being the Geological Society, I've got to throw in a couple of geology slides. So the reservoir is a pretty conventional anticline, so that, by which I mean, you know, upturned pudding bowl. It's held hydrocarbon gas for 50 to 60 million years, so that's the best indication we have that it will safely and securely hold CO2. In terms of the reservoir properties, it's a very clean sand, so it's, for the geologists amongst you, it's a Darcy permeability and it's about 24% porosity. So very clean, very well connected, and from the point of view of the question, will it leak, there's very few wells in it, so the wells tend to be the point at which a store might leak. So, you know, from a containment, from a storage point of view, this, I think, is generally accepted to be as good as we'll find in the North Sea. Again, I'm not trying to be arrogant. This has been analysed over the years, over the last 4 or 5 years, by a lot of experts and very well characterised and modelled. And I think most experts say, look, if CCS is going to work, at least in a hydrocarbon reservoir in the North Sea, then this is as good a candidate field that we'll get. Interestingly, it sits in a much bigger sand body, so a fairway of sand, a channel of sand that stretches for miles both to the west and to the east of Goldeneye. There's Goldeneye, just a little pimple in the middle of this big fairway of sand, which slopes up as you move west, and I think eventually outcrops on the seabed, you know, much closer to Scotland. The reason for mentioning that is because the North Sea, is continually recharging this, so the pressure in that channel is hydrostatic. Yeah, at least it was when we started producing gas from the field. As we produced the gas, the pressure dropped, so it started about 3,500 psi, dropped about 2,600, and even though we've stopped producing and not doing anything with the field, it's now slowly, very slowly, repressuring, and it will continue to repressure until it gets back to hydrostatic. And we think that's because this is just a long, continuous, well-connected body of sand that is being recharged. And incidentally, there's several other fields that have produced or still producing from that body of sand. So you can see several other oil and gas fields shown in that picture. And in terms of the cross-section, there's Goldeneye Reservoir down there. You see the cap rock and sort of several other seals. So there's, in terms of the seals, there's belt and braces and a piece of string as well. So these are mainly marls, you know, sort of mudstones and marls, and obviously tight in the sense that it will not allow gas to permeate through. And there's also that big body of chalk, which is about 750 meters thick. So that was all I was going to do in detail on the Peterhead project. So time now to switch into a sort of more global picture. So globally, how many projects have we got? Only 8, and I think they're all listed on the slide, and they're there for other reasons. The projects to capture CO2 and inject it are there because operators are producing gas which has got high CO2 levels, and they need to remove the CO2 in order to sell the gas, or it's there because the operators want to use the CO2 to get more oil out of the ground. So to be clear, we can use CO2 to enhance our oil recovery, and that process is commonly known as EOR, enhanced oil recovery. So only 8 projects globally, which means that we've fallen behind. So CCS globally is really off the pace. So I go back to those IEA, International Energy Agency figures that I showed you earlier on, and they were based on a premise that by 2020, we'd have a lot more in place. So by 2020, we'd be capturing, what's that, well over 250 million tonnes. And even if all the planned projects come to fruition, we're going to fall short of that target or that expectation by, let's say for round numbers, 100 million tonnes per annum. Now, to put that into perspective, that's not just a little shortfall, that's a huge shortfall. So if you remember, Peterhead is going to capture about 1 million tons of CO2 per year. So that shortfall of 100 there is equivalent to 100 Peterhead projects. Longannet would have captured twice as much, so it's 50 Longannet projects. So that is a huge shortfall, even if everything that's on the drawing board comes to fruition. So why are they failing? We'll dwell on this now for 5 to 10 minutes. In Europe, a lot of projects have been on the drawing board, have attracted European funding, but are now being cancelled or are stalling, partly public opinion, partly money. I'll come back to that. Just to be clear on this slide, these are the 6 projects that received EEPR funding. That's the European Energy Programme for Recovery. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the 2 red ones in Germany and Poland have been cancelled. Certainly the German one was cancelled for public opinion reasons. I think the 3 yellow ones are stalled, mainly waiting for money. And I think the green one in Spain is still proceeding. Incidentally, if you live in Hertfordshire, don't be alarmed, because the Europeans think Hatfield is in Hertfordshire, whereas it should actually be Hatfield in Yorkshire, different Hatfield. And if you're working on the Don Valley project in Hatfield and you haven't sort of received your cheque from the European Union yet, it's probably because it's gone to Hatfield in Hertfordshire. So that was one European funding scheme. The other one, again, David referred to this in the intro, NER, which stands for New Entrants Reserve. Last year made a lot of awards for carbon capture and renewable projects. In fact, there were no carbon capture projects. Ended up receiving money. So they had to relaunch this. This is the relaunch document from last month. And so another story of European funding being there, but not actually being utilised. The Shell story, just concentrate on Shell for a couple of minutes. Globally, we've got a portfolio of projects developing at different stages. So the blue one, Mongstad, is in Norway. That's a test centre. That's capture only. The green one in Canada is a tar sands project. So we're capturing CO2, really what we call license to operate reasons. And there's others, big one in Australia, Gorgon, and obviously our own project, Peterhead. So different stages of development, but a nice little portfolio. And the reason that we're building up a portfolio is quite a conscious decision to build our competences across the board. So no one of those projects will tell you everything. But by having a varied portfolio, you can literally just tick the different boxes of knowledge that you need to build up, expertise that you need to build up. So we're actually quite comfortable that our portfolio, which is a global portfolio, will allow us to build competence in all the different aspects where we need to learn. So that's the Shell story. Let's just go back to the global story of, you know, why is CCS lagging behind? That IEA slide showed quite a dramatic shortfall. So why is CCS lagging behind? So I could say there's 3 reasons. Money, money, and money, but that would be very glib. But it is part of the answer. So this is the cost of the Longannet project, the one that got cancelled 2 or 3 years ago, and you can see there the total CAPEX. I'm just talking about what it costs to build rather than what it costs to operate. Just to build, that's £1.3 billion. So even though the Chancellor very generously offered us £1 billion, that billion still would not have been enough to build the Longannet project. And the King's North project, which was cancelled, as I said, slightly earlier than ours, that was £1.4 billion. So Peterhead is not that expensive. I'll hasten to add, I can't tell you exactly how much it is because we're in a competition bound by competition rules. But the message I want to get across is CCS is expensive. I wouldn't want to kid you otherwise. At least it's expensive when you do it for the first time. So what we call first of a kind. The whole point is, though, as you do it more and more, it gets cheaper. As you go to next of a kind and then what we call nth of a kind, hopefully you go up the learning curve and the costs decline. And you'll recognize that phenomenon. You know, mobile phones, laptops, everything gets cheaper the more that it gets up the learning curve. So the point is, you know, yeah, Peterhead and the White Rose project are undoubtedly going to be expensive, but we have to, as a nation, make that commitment to start going up the learning curve. And the government recognises that as well. So this is a cost reduction task force report on CCS that was issued just a couple of weeks ago, and it makes the point that you know, CCS as a mitigant for CO2 emissions is competitive. We can achieve a cost of about £100 per megawatt hour. And the reason that that's significant is that's quite a widely quoted benchmark. It comes from, for instance, offshore wind. That's the price that offshore wind farms can achieve. CCS is competitive with that. So the main message here is, you know, CCS is part of a basket of mitigation measures, and it's competitive in price. And as you go up the learning curve, there is the potential to reduce that significantly below £100 per megawatt hour. So cost and money is a big part of the story. Another part is public opinion. I referred to the German scheme that got cancelled. We Shell had one in Barendrecht in Holland, which was cancelled due to adverse public opinion. Those are schemes where the CO2 is planned to be stored onshore, on land. And I hasten to add, of course, Peterhead, we're storing the CO2 100 kilometres offshore. But public opinion is interesting. And so I'm just going to show you 3 slides from a survey that was actually conducted in the States. And I thank Howard Herzog at the MIT for giving me permission to use these. So there's a lot of work they've done, but it shows a couple of interesting things. So first of all, in the States, there is good acknowledgement of the global warming problem. So when asked about, you know, which environmental problems do you consider to be most important, you know, half the respondents put global warming in their top 2. That's the good news. The not so good news is when asked about which solutions they'd heard of, not many knew of carbon capture and storage as a potential solution. So I think the challenge is for us as a CCS industry to be much more proactive about making that link between global warming, the need to do something about it, and the fact that CCS is a good part of the solution to the problem. The last slide is also really interesting. I said I'd try and personalize this for you. So ask yourselves the question, how much would you be prepared to spend to solve global warming? Because I'm afraid, you know, we've said these projects are expensive, and I'm afraid the inevitable consequences will translate into slightly higher electricity bills. But if the problem's, you know, that drastic, and if we have to do something about it, how much would you spend? So this is the question they asked in the States. And the interesting thing is, even in the States, and I say even because I've noticed from the previous project that they pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, and there is sort of a lot of ambivalence about CCS in the States, but even in the States, folk are prepared to pay, a lot of folk are prepared to pay something, and some folk are prepared to pay a lot. So that's, you know, nearly 10% of the public prepared to pay $100 per month, per month extra in their electricity bills if they're comfortable that it'll solve global warming. Another part of the problem, just sticking with the theme of why is CCS not taking off, is infrastructure. This is a tricky one. So the first projects are going to have to work really hard to put that infrastructure in place for the benefit of all the other projects that might come along later on. We're lucky with the Peterhead project in that the pipelines and the infrastructure is largely there. But I show here a couple of other schemes. So this is Yorkshire and this is Rotterdam. Where the developers have to invest more up front to make that infrastructure available. So, I mean, there's lots of ways of solving that, but I think that the bottom line is help from government would go some way towards, you know, getting these schemes up and running. I work on an initiative called ZEP, Zero Emissions Platform. We're just about to produce a report on this whole topic. So these 3 bullets are taken from that report. So really just encouraging governments throughout Europe to help us set the infrastructure up to create this CCS industry that's needed. Good news is there is some money available, not not a lot, but credit where credit's due. So our own UK government, as I've already suggested, have put up £1 billion, and you can see in orange how this compares. Only I think Australia have got more money available on the table at the moment for CCS developers. So all credit to the UK for at least trying to kickstart this industry. Okay, just a couple of slides to wrap up with, and this is a Shell acronym, TCOP. I guess probably no one in the room recognises this, so let me just take time out to explain. TCOP is a device that we use for our projects to make sure we're covering all the bases. It would have been very easy for me to stand here today and just tell you a technical story, and that's what the T stands for, technical. But actually, the technical aspects of CCS are pretty much sorted. Okay, there's a few challenges. I've talked about scaling up to a larger size. I've talked about Joule-Thomson cooling, a few challenges, but largely the technical issues are sorted. The problem lies more with the other softer issues. So E stands for economic, C for commercial, O for organisational, and a company like Shell should be able to organise this, and P stands for political, and it's those kind of softer commercial and political aspects where I've put a question mark, because those are really the areas where we're still lacking. Projects have been cancelled for commercial and political reasons rather than technical reasons. So, to answer the question, why are CCS projects failing, the answers lie more with the E, C and the P. Key messages, just to finish up with. CCS is essential. I hope I've made the case for CCS. I hope I've explained how we are still and will continue to be reliant on fossil fuels. CO2 will continue to be emitted in large quantities. That will cause temperatures to rise unless we do something about it. So I hope that the case for CCS or case for carbon reduction is clear, and CCS is part of the solution. And it says there, in a world based on stringent CO2 regulations, but actually that case is there whether you've got the regulations or not. But despite all the good work that has been done so far, both in Europe and more widely globally, we are falling behind. We're not just a short way behind, we're a long way behind. We're 100 Peterhead projects behind. Within Shell, we're trying to do our bit. We've got a portfolio of projects which are building our competence, and a lot of those lessons, a lot of those learnings are being shared. So all the lessons from Longannet are publicly available. And just, if I can get there, one slide to finish up with on an optimistic note. This is Peterhead on another cold and crisp and windy, or windless December day, but I think hopefully the future is bright. Thank you very much.
Well, we have time for some questions.
Just a minute or two.
Just a minute or two. There's a gentleman in the front. Hang on a minute, the roving mic is coming round to you. There you are.
Hello, Tony Edwards, architect. I'm very concerned indeed about us not going fast enough. I've been reading the book that's published this year by two Energy Institute lecturers at University College, Berners-Lee and Clark, who The Burning Question, and they say that while carbon capture and storage is important to pursue, it is a long, long way before we'll have some globally useful amounts, long past the time when it may be too late. They say very alarmingly indeed that of the approved or fossil fuel reserves in the world, there's that we have, the oil companies and your own company and the gas companies have, 4/5 will not be able to be used if we are to stop the world from having runaway climate change destroying human race. And they say this 400 parts per million figure that you gave us is what the United Nations scientists say we are now a 50-50 chance of having runaway climate change today. This is very alarming because the 2% is disputed by a lot of scientists. It's far too much, but we've already got runaway climate change. Could I ask you this sort of overall picture of Shell approach to you're causing climate change for your grandson, who you introduced the idea in your early slide. He will suffer, not you, if we burn all the reserves we have. What is Shell's approach to this?
So it's a good question, because yeah, obviously we recognise that fossil fuels are part of the problem. I personally recognise that the 30 years I've had in the industry has contributed to that, and that's partly what drives me to try and do something about it. So Shell is trying to do its bit to solve the problem, but I think you have to understand that the problem and the severity and the magnitude of the problem have not been fully appreciated until fairly recently. So we talked about Kyoto Protocol, 1997. That's really when the penny started to drop, and the Shell and the globe have been using fossil fuels for far longer than that. So I think it's recognition has arrived late in the day, but we do indeed need to do something about it very quickly.
Oh, can you work your way back in a minute?
Yeah.
There's a gentleman halfway around the... Oh, there first of all, right, yeah.
A minor thing in comparison. You showed the UK energy use going down. Does that include for the effect of importing goods, probably more than we export, that goods that used a lot of energy to produce? So
to be clear, the slide showing UK energy demand goes up. The slide I showed going down was yes. CO2 emissions.
CO2, okay, CO2, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Yes. So the question was, does that include, so that's a mix of all the industrial emissions, all the transport emissions, all the domestic emissions, but it won't.
So if China is producing goods and there's a lot of CO2 that we use, it may be that our CO2 per person is going up. That'll be recorded against China's name, not ours. Yeah. So that's physical emissions from the UK.
Rightio, can you work your way back, Naomi? Be an agent of your own destiny. There we go.
On the political side, on the political side, is it easier to justify the UK taxpayer subsidising a Shell project when Shell is producing CO2 in the infamous tar sands in Canada, and also a lot of gas flaring in Nigeria over the last half century?
Wow, so there's a lot of themes wrapped up in that one question, so let me try and disentangle them. So, first of all, it's a shared problem. It's not just Shell's problem. I've already said Shell is part of the problem, but we all use oil and gas, and I guess most of you will have come by car or train tonight. So it's a shared problem that we all need to do something about. I think Shell actually has been quite proactive compared with some of our competitors in sticking its head above the parapets and putting its hands in its pockets and trying to get this project off the ground. So yeah, I take what you say. We have contributed to the problem, but we're also trying to contribute to the solution. Well, I come back to the earlier comment that we all use energy. I mean, I defy anyone in the room to stick their hand up and say they don't use energy. Yeah, and that is exactly why the Quest project has been required to take the CO2 and inject it. So that Quest project that I showed on one of the slides is all about taking the CO2 produced by tar sands operations. Indeed.
Press on, press on.
Hi Paul, Mark Davis, McKinsey. If there's 100 missing projects of the Peterhead scale, that's I guess about $100 billion, which is a massive number compared to about the $400 billion of the...
And it's pounds, not dollars, so it's even more.
Well, even bigger. I mean, I think if my figures are right, the industry spends about $500 billion, oil and gas industry. So we're talking about a massive scale of investment. How are we going to do it?
Well, it's a good question. So that's a global figure, so that's, that hopefully that duty is spread across the planet. But it is a big ask. It will get cheaper, as I said, we'll go up the learning curve and things will get cheaper. But it is a big ask, and it will inevitably translate into higher electricity bills. But I mean, the same can be said of nuclear power and the other solutions, wind power. They all cost money. So I think as a society, we have to face up to the fact that energy in the future is going to be more expensive. Either that, or atmospheric CO2 levels continue to rise, temperatures continue to rise. We actually don't have much choice.
Let's just move. Can you move around? So, so people over here. That's it. Let's do that gentleman first.
Just a fundamental point. You said that a few of these projects failed because they were not commercial. How exactly does Shell get paid?
For the Peterhead project?
Yeah, I mean, you store X million tons of carbon, of CO2. How do you actually get paid?
Yeah, so it's a fair question, and unfortunately I can't tell you too much because we are bound by the competition rules, and besides, contracts have not been signed, so the actual mechanics of this have not been fully landed. But the demonstration project that we're hoping to get off the ground at Peterhead is not typical. I mean, that will rely on government funding, and Shell will have to put its hands in its pockets as well, but the money will come partly from the government, partly from Shell to build it. And then as we go forward and operate it, you'll see that the costs will translate, as I say, into higher electricity bills.
So the electricity companies would pay you to store the CO2?
So don't take the Peterhead project
I'm talking in general
what might
terms.
happen in future. Yes, I think to try and keep this simple, the money received from selling electricity will channel back into paying for the project. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Let me say one thing else. One other thing is that the returns on this are not huge. We're not doing this to make money. So Shell is partly putting its hands in its pocket, but it's also using money which could have been used for more lucrative projects elsewhere. So we're not doing this to make money.
So why are you doing it? We're
doing it to partly because we've got the assets, the GOLDENEYE asset, partly to safeguard future gas sales. So in that sense, it is about money, but it's about keeping gas as a competitive part of the energy mix.
Let's have someone from down here. Lovely.
With the Thames sewer, it's the burden of the cost falls on Thames water payers. Will the burden of the costs be spread out over the whole country or just the area that has it?
That's a really good question, because the energy network in the UK is actually quite complicated. But I think higher costs at Peterhead, say, will eventually find their way into the bills of most UK electricity consumers. Yes. So you can imagine that the company that operates Peterhead, which is SSE, would apply the additional costs to the bills of all its customers. You can't distinguish between which customers are taking electricity from Peterhead and which customers are taking electricity from a power station in Yorkshire. Electricity is fed into the grid, and then it's effectively a mix.
But you can choose which company you get your electricity from.
Of course, yes.
And if that one is more expensive, people...
In that sense, nothing changes, yeah. You can do that today, and I'm sure you'll be able to do that in 20 years' time.
We've time for one more, because we're at risk of the Jolsox white wine warming up. So, sir, you have the last question.
No, I'm privileged, thank you.
So my advice is stick to the red.
That's right, the red will be okay.
So, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
There's a danger here, I think, in the way we presented in the questions, that only a quarter of our energy use is electricity. 3/4 is natural resource burned in our boilers and in our cars. So actually, to be perfectly honest, I'd rather take your £1 billion and use it to make my car 10% more efficient, my boiler 10% more efficient. Then I would be doing a lot more benefit than your project, which is aimed at a very small portion of it. The second contribution I might make is that the Tyndall Institute, which comprises 8 universities in the UK, has proven pretty successfully around the world that we're past 2 degrees. We're actually past 4 degrees. We're somewhere between 4 and 5. The damage is already done. What you need to recognize, I think, or the world needs to recognize, is that what we don't do to combat that is go and turn the air conditioners on. We need to find different solutions to a given problem which is already created. We've done that damage. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, and so those are two very good points. I'm not necessarily going to argue with you, except that it's easier at this stage in the game to do a big project on one source rather than lots of little projects around, domestic users. So I think it's a pragmatic way to start, but I'm not in the end, not denying that tackling all sources of CO2 is required.
Well, thank you. It's been an excellent evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
indeed.
David. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.